So we're going to break us back into the afternoon gently with a bit of a story from Colm.
Hello everyone, I'm Colm Molloy. I'm Head of Learning and Development with Pride at Work, and I'm here to talk to you about the power of storytelling. But before we get into it, I'd like to do a little bit of a grounding exercise. So as this year marks 10 years since we all said yes in the marriage referendum, this grounding is all about putting positivity into your body, and there are 3 elements, so you can kind of do as many as you like. And the great thing about this is that even if you don't participate, it'll still impact you. So here's what we're going to do. First up, we're going to get into a power pose. So you can either put your hands on your hips like Wonder Woman, or put your arms above your head like Eva Perón. We're going to be on our feet for the next part of this. The second element is that we're going to vocalize. So we're going to do what we did 10 years ago and say yes to each other. Just yes, 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 yes. Over and over. So on a chemical level, your brain loves that. Your brain loves saying yes, and it also loves hearing it. So in a second, we're going to do a whole minute of it. But finally, just to make it a little bit tricky, we're going to add some lymphatic rebounding. This is contraindicated if you're pregnant, and I think that also applies to food babies. So I'm going to show you what it is, but if you feel uncomfortable, just don't do it. So basically, we're going to bounce. So just to recap, pose, toes, yos. Okay, everybody ready? Yes, 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 yes. Beautiful. So, today's story brings us into the 18th century, and we're going to take a look at the ladies of Clongauchlin, who were 2 upper-class Irish women from Kilkenny, named Lady Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby. And you can see by the dates that they were a bit of a May-December romance. There was a 16-year age gap. And they went when Sarah was a teenager, and she confided in Eleanor that she was being harassed by a kind of creepy uncle. So Eleanor stayed with her as a sort of chaperone. And Sarah's family didn't really approve of their teenage daughter associating with this worldly spinster who, read books and stuff. But they couldn't keep them apart. And over the years, their relationship kind of blossomed into something more. In 1777, when Sarah was 22, they ran away together rather than face the possibility of being forced into unwanted marriages. But they were caught by their families and brought home. But undeterred, they hatched a second plot to escape. Enlisting the help of Sarah's maid, Mary Carroll, Sarah concealed Eleanor in her bedroom for some months. Now, Mary was fondly known as Mary the Bruiser, and contemporaries describe her as an Irish savage and a mannish woman, so they weren't very nice about her, as you can sort of see from this contemporary cartoon. But the ladies loved her, and she lived with them and worked for them for the rest of her life. With various help, they were able to sell off their jewellery and scrounge together a little bit of money from sympathetic friends and family. And in April of 1778, they moved to Wales and then sent for Mary. And they set up a little paradise. They renovated a dilapidated Gothic cottage, which they named Place Nevid, or the New Palace in English. And they developed these extraordinary formal gardens, and it became a fashionable retreat for writers. And they very much lived as a married couple. These hot chocolate cups they had made bear both of their family crests and a monogram made up of an intertwined EB and SP. The historian Eugene Coyle recounts that a selection of their pet dogs were named Sappho after the lesbian poet of antiquity. And so they were quite kind of open about their relationship. They wore riding habits at all with top hats at all times, which was considered provocatively masculine at the time. And they sort of marketed themselves as a curiosity. You can see here that they sold postcards of themselves in their man clothes. So they kind of used the exoticism of their relationship to market the retreat. Anne Lister, who was kind of more famously known as Gentleman Jack, who was a wealthy gender nonconformist who lived a scandalously kind of trans-masculine life at this time, stayed with them often and was inspired by their relationship to informally marry their own lover. They also entertained real luminaries of the day, such as Byron, Shelley, and Wordsworth, who actually wrote a sonnet for them. The last 2 lines read, "Sisters in love, a love allowed to climb, even on this earth above the reach of time." So sort of beautiful. Mary died first, and they were all buried in the same plot with the same grave marker, which some people take as evidence that their relationship is that of a polyamorous throuple. Now, the thing is, Eleanor and Sarah's relationship was carried out in the open at a time when that was a really shocking thing to do. So I like to think that they wouldn't have balked at acknowledging Mary as she was their lover. But it was a very different time. And while it's one thing for two aristocratic ladies to be a rich lesbian power couple and a tourist attraction, it's quite another to dally with the help. I will say that it's very unusual to be buried with a servant. So the polyamory theory is not without merit, but we just don't know. But whether this was a love triangle or a chosen family, the ladies of Clongauchlin lived bravely, defiantly and tenderly on their own terms. Cute, right? But why this happy love story? Why is it important? Well, because our brains love stories. And several things happen in our brains when we hear a good one. So first of all, thanks to a process called neural coupling, when we hear a story, our brains turn the story into our own ideas and experience. So part of the experience is universal to the audience in that it's narrated, but each person will feel the story in their own personal way. If I tell you someone is beautiful, you'll all imagine a different face, but you'll all imagine somebody who's beautiful. So there's a kind of a commonality there. Secondly, because of a process called mirroring, listeners will experience similar brain activities to each other and also to the speaker when they hear a story. And this kind of bonds the group. We get this charged feeling of resonance and commonality. Thirdly, we have a lot more brain activity when we hear a story. So when we're processing facts, only two areas of the brain are activated, Broca's area and Wernicke's area. When we deliver the same information through a story, we engage many additional areas, including the motor cortex, the sensory cortex, and the frontal cortex. We sort of feel the story in our bodies. This is why statistics on violence often don't elicit an emotional response, but someone's individual case story is much more likely to resonate. And finally, we undergo complex hormonal releases when we hear a story. The brain releases dopamine into the system when it experiences an emotionally charged event. And this also happens when we hear about an emotionally charged event that happens to someone else. So this makes information delivered through a story easier to remember and to remember with greater accuracy. We also release oxytocin, which is the love hormone. So when we hear a story, it bonds us both to the storyteller and to the people in the story. And this last part is both why LGBTQ plus stories and the stories of oppressed minorities have historically been erased, and why it's important to share and explore these stories. Put simply, on a chemical level, you're less likely to trust and empathize with a group if their stories aren't told. You don't have that oxytocin neural bedrock. So you're more likely to think of their lives and problems as abstract, and you're also more porous to negative assumptions. Stories also have the power to change schemata. In psychology and cognitive science, a schema is a mental framework or structure that helps us organize and interpret information. Our brains like to group things that are similar, and schemata are like templates in our mind for how we expect something to be. They're built up from our past experience to shape how we understand the world. So, for example, if I say dog, most people will have a kind of a positive schema and imagine a fluffy, furry friend. But some people will have had a traumatic experience with a vicious dog, for example, and for them, the word will have a very different schema. Schemata are a necessary simplification. They help us make quick sense of new information by relating it to what we already know. But the shortcut comes at a cost because they can also bias our interpretation of new experiences. If someone is repeatedly exposed only to negative stories or experiences, especially without any balancing positive ones, their schema for that topic or group can become distorted or overly negative. For example, if someone only ever hears tragic or traumatic stories about LGBTQ plus people, their schema for queer life might become centered on suffering, marginalization, or danger. They may also unconsciously expect queer relationships to be unstable or for queer people to be victims or outcasts. And even if they encounter joyful or successful queer stories later, those may be discounted as, or interpreted as exceptions. This kind of negative schema can develop for LGBTQ plus people too, manifesting as internalized homophobia, transphobia, or racial bias, where people kind of absorb and apply negative narratives to themselves and to their communities. To illustrate this, I'm going to tell you another little story, which is my own. I came out to my father in 1994, and it was a very different Ireland. We'd only decriminalised the previous year, and effective treatment for HIV was in its infancy, so the media narrative around AIDS catastrophised and kind of stigmatised the victims. And my father was supportive in that he said he still loved me, but he said that he hoped I would grow out of it because it would be a very lonely life. And for a little while I thought he might be right. I was being bullied in school. I didn't really have any friends until I kind of got into college. And I kind of took the feedback from my father, and it made things feel sort of hopeless. But on the whole, my dad was dead wrong. My identity led me to activism, and this led to a life filled with wild parties, a fabulously diverse friend pool, and just lots of adventures. I met my husband-to-be when I was 19, and here we are, madly in love 25 years later. It's certainly been an eventful life, but seldom lonely. What happened there? Oh.
Hey.
My father expected my story to be tragic because those were the only stories about people like me that he had heard. And as someone working with LGBTQ plus history and storytelling, this has real impact. If we only hear stories of suffering, we risk reinforcing negative schemata. Even if we mean it kindly and we're trying to acknowledge and honour real struggles, it's not healthy to only think about a group of people in terms of the negative aspects of their lives. Furthermore, if those are the only stories you hear about people like you, it can be hard to imagine yourself as something good or worthy. If we include love, joy, resilience, silliness, pleasure, and everyday humanity, we can expand or challenge this schemata, creating more balanced and affirming frameworks. It's important to engage with minorities in our stories, but there are some pitfalls to avoid. So first of all, when asking for people's stories, be aware that people within minorities may feel an ambassadorial burden, that is, that they're speaking for their people, so they may cause harm if they misinform or anger the questioner. And also remember that while a member of a minority may be the only member of that minority you've ever met, you're certainly not the only curious person that they've ever met. And talking about yourself or your people as an abstract can be kind of exhausting. It's great that you want to hear someone's story, but they may not want to talk about when they first knew they were gay or what it's like to be trans these days. So if someone seems fed up, just consider changing the subject. If you have questions, particularly if they're not appropriate to the workplace, do your own research. Be aware that when you're reading stuff online, algorithmic tracking will give you more of the content you favour. So if you have biases or prejudices, even if they're not on a conscious level, the content you find is more likely to reflect and reinforce them. And there's a lot of misinformation out there as well, so try and gather information from more than one source. I once used AI to research LGBTQ plus identities in Viking society for another one of these history talks, and what it came up with was really rich and really fascinating, but when I fact-checked it, I realised that the source material was actually erotic fan fiction based on Marlowe's 4. So, just check things out. LGBTQ plus movies are a great way to hear more of our stories, and most streaming services now have a dedicated section. But again, try and get a bit of a mix. We have lots of really sad stories. There's persecution and isolation and the horrors of the AIDS epidemic. And these tend to get made into movies more because they're really important. They're more dramatic. But if you just hear the sad stories, it can give you a kind of a skewed sense of queer reality. So try to throw in a romantic comedy or two. We're made to enjoy stories, so finally and most importantly, have fun with it. Unless you're writing a talk, you don't really need to do hardcore research, so don't stress yourself out. Just add a few stories about people who aren't like you to your Netflix binging schedule. By making space for queer love stories, both in history and in our everyday lives, we help build a world where they can never be erased again. Thank you.